You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAC Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, everyone. This is your host, Cuckoo. And I just wanted to come to you today with a topic that I came across recently in the New York Times. There was a recent New York Times article called Working to Close the Breastfeeding Gap. And I found it very interesting, very eye-opening, because I learned some things that I had not been aware of. Apparently, African American women are not encouraged to, as much as white women are, to breastfeed their children. The rationale behind it is claimed because black women didn't learn the practice or were not encouraged in the practice by their mothers and the women before them. Now, I found this to be shocking because being Caribbean myself and being in a largely Caribbean portion of the black community in America, that also includes some black Americans, some Africans, I tend to see black women breastfeeding their children. I've always known that to be the case, so it's kind of shocking to me to see that there is this gap in breastfeeding between black, white, and Hispanic women. Now, what they do in the hospitals, and see, this is the thing that we got to understand about white supremacy. White supremacy, it attacks you on all areas, on all levels of the life that you live. They're not just going to attack you in one area and allow you to flourish in others. That would make sense. So to completely dominate you, they attack you in all areas. But, and this is the thing that this show is all about, you have to show some black excellence. You have to take it upon yourself to be better, even under the circumstances of oppression. If you go back to before the Civil Rights era, this is how you have a Black Wall Street, or Rosewood, Florida. This is how you had black prosperity even during Jim Crow. People took it upon themselves to live up to a certain standard, to recognize the circumstances they were under, and to make sure that they did things within themselves that made sense for not only themselves but for their community. So in the system of white supremacy, one of the things that's being done is that black women are being encouraged not to breastfeed. They're being encouraged in a few different ways. I'm going to touch on some of these ways today. But one of the things that happens with black women in the hospital, right after they give birth, they're given formula supplements early on. And it's mostly happening to lower income populations, not just black women, but lower income black Hispanics, Latinos, black women, etc. But here's the staggering numbers. The staggering numbers that African American newborns are 9 times more likely than white babies to get formula in the hospital. Hispanics, they found, or Latinos, they found, of similar status to those same black women that they looked at, they found that they're 91% more likely to initiate breastfeeding than black women are. The reason? Well, there's a family history of breastfeeding. They saw their mothers breastfeed. Their mothers mothers breastfed, so they continue that tradition of breastfeeding. In fact, only 66.4% of black women initiate breastfeeding, with only about 50% still breastfeeding beyond 6 months. And these numbers are going to be important in what I talk about later. In fact, they're very significant. One of the things that's also contributing to this is that there's no lactation experts being offered. There's no one really teaching black women how to breastfeed, how to overcome some of the obstacles, the early obstacles of breastfeeding. And I find that to be very sad and very alarming. Men can't necessarily teach women how to breastfeed, right? We don't have that experience. That's not a tool set that we're born with. So you would think that the women folk from the previous generation, the sister friends, this, that, and the other, you would think someone would be extending their hand, even if there's no lactation experts in the hospitals, but someone would be extending their hand to help, assist, and encourage black women to breastfeed. So we got to ask the question, why is that? Why is it? And I guess the question has been answered because most women, black women it seems, don't have a history of breastfeeding. So then the next question is, well, why aren't there any lactation specialists to assist these black women in the hospitals? And I think the reason is because the system of white supremacy has understood the power of breastfeeding. And I'll talk about exactly what the power of breastfeeding is in a few minutes. So, in the article, one of the women who was in the study was quoted as having said something along the lines of, well, black women don't want to be slaves or have kids too attached to them via breastfeeding. Now, that slave comment comes from a historical perspective. In history, you had during slavery what was called a wet nurse. And during that time, slave owners used and bought black women to nurse their white children. In fact, they would stop black women from nursing their own children to nurse these white children of the oppressor. So what ended up happening between those women and their own flesh and blood children, there was a stunting of the mothering experience. When you have that stunting of the mothering experience, and then the next generation doesn't learn how to breastfeed, and then the next one after that, that means we have a little bit of a mothering problem going on here in the black community. One of the problems with black women being wet nurses to these white children of the oppressor is that they were transferring certain health benefits to these white children and denying those same health benefits via breastfeeding. They were denying that to their own black children. So right there, we see a huge problem in not only in the dynamic of mothering, but we actually see where black women were used to empower and to energize and energize the children of their own oppressor. One of the things you may or may not know, in the African American community, when it comes to reproduction, they found that there's a lot of premature births, where children have low birth weights. There's a lot of infant mortality. And, breast milk can't stop the premature births, but it can definitely increase the low birth weights. And it's known that it could positively affect these infant mortality rates. So when we don't breastfeed our children, ladies, we are doing huge amounts of damage to our successive generations. And the real kicker is going to come later on when I tell you a certain correlation that they found between breastfeeding and the outcomes of children in the future. So let's talk about what some of these benefits are for breastfeeding. In general, you have better birth outcomes. You lower certain poor health issues. You prevent infant mortality, like I mentioned. You increase the immune system development. So all of these things that a lot of black kids suffer from, the allergies, the asthma, childhood obesity, all of these things you can help to prevent if you would breastfeed your children. For the baby, when you talk about advantages of breastfeeding for the baby, essential nutrients build better brains for the children. Like I said, it could lower allergies, colds, childhood illnesses, childhood obesity, etc. For the mother, some of the benefits of breastfeeding your children is that it provides, weight loss. It's a natural birth control. That tells me a whole lot, too, about what's going on with a lot of women having a lot of children. And I'm not against women having a lot of children, but I am against having a lot of children when you don't have a way to support them. And that's for men and women, by the way. But breastfeeding your children will provide a natural birth control. It contracts the uterus. And the main thing I want to talk about, it allows for bonding between the mother and the baby. So knowing that, how did it become a thing where black women who historically, or through slavery, etc., and before that, how is it that black women started relying on these formulas to feed their babies? Well, again, in the system of white supremacy, if you want to make something stick in a community, you market that thing heavy to a community. And as it turns out, when formulas first came to be, white women were heavily using formula. They were the first ones. They led the way in terms of formula. Black women were still wet nursing. Now, there is the aspect of black women after having gone through slavery, they, as someone mentioned in the Facebook page for the podcast. By the way, if you're not subscribed to our Facebook page where we originally posted the actual article from the New York Times, make sure to go ahead and do that at Bitter Medicine Show on Facebook. And one of our followers there mentioned the fact that slavery did a number on black women, and the advent of formula just kind of like finished it off. And when I did my research into it, I realized the truth in that statement. White women initially were the forerunners in using baby formula to feed their children. part of the reason why, and this also ties into why they had wet nurses or slave women breastfeeding white children. Part of that came from the idea that breastfeeding destroyed your figure. And so these white women, in their mind, to maintain whatever figure they think they have, they had these enslaved women who were also laborers, by the way, who were also mothers themselves, by the way. They further enslaved them by making them also have to breastfeed their children. And so as a carryover, white women themselves, for a long time, never wanted to breastfeed their own children. That was just a part of the culture for them. So after antebellum slavery ended and you really couldn't get black folks to do that kind of shit anymore, even in Jim Crow and since Jim Crow and beyond, well, they had that problem. They were having these children, and how do you maintain this way of feeding your children without having to, in your mind, lose your figure whilst breastfeeding? So the formula became a thing. And so white women led the way with formula, and black women followed. And that's another thing I need black folks, men and women, to stop following these white folks all the time. Stop doing what you see them do. Let them do them. You do you. And so black women started to follow this trend, and at some point, white women decided that they wanted to be more natural, be more bonded with their children. And so they kind of gave up the formula thing. But black women never did. And here lies a great issue with black women not having given up the formula at least when white women had turned away from it. I know I just said that we need to stop following these folks, but we need to stop following them from the jump. We need to assess things for ourselves. And this is also where, and I'm going to talk about this later on. As a scientist myself, someone who's been in research for a number of years, we really need more black folks to not just become medical doctors. We have a lot of black doctors out here, although it can be argued a lot of black doctors really are doctors for white folks. They're not really doctors for us, because I see the Russian doctors and stuff in the black community all the time. I live in a Caribbean neighborhood, mostly Haitian, and the doctors that all of us go to are some that's convenient to us, are some white folks. But we really got to start pushing ourselves in different areas. I spoke about this in a previous podcast about low energy. We tend to do the same type things. We tend to do medicine and business and maybe a little engineering and nursing. Like almost every black woman is a nurse, and the others are teachers. And that's fine and well. I'm not trying to diss that. But what I'm saying is we need to encourage our children to fan out into other areas more. Let's have more people in arts. Let's have more people in science. I'm talking about real research. I'm talking about, if you're a Caribbean person, if you've been on Facebook in the last 5 years, you've seen all the memes talking about the fact that soursop, for example, is more effective than cancer. Well, we need research for that. We have all these Caribbean black folks coming to America and going different places to get an education in medicine, but they're not getting an education in research, and so we're not researching the things that can cure ourselves. We had the elder Dr. Sebi, who was doing his work, but it would be nice to have a scientific approach to the work that he was doing, and to have some written research, some written results that we all can look to and pick up the sense from the nonsense. And if we had done something like this years ago, decades ago, we would have been able to know not to ever jump on that formula bandwagon. Because the formula could never replace the properties of the breast milk and could never replace the vessel that's expressing the breast milk, which is the black woman. So let's just run it down real quick. In the hospitals you give birth, they don't give you any lactation specialists. You don't have any network of other black women who can encourage you, teach you where you need to be taught on how to lactate, how to breastfeed your offspring. You followed the white woman in her shenanigans to use a scientifically made formula that's only providing nutrients but doesn't provide any of the other benefits that I listed earlier. And so now we're here. But there's also, I listed off the benefits, which were for the mother was weight loss, natural birth control, contracts the uterus, allows for bonding with the baby. That's going to be important later on. For the baby, the benefits of breastfeeding, you get the essential nutrients for better brains. You lower the incidences of allergies and colds during the kid's childhood, and all other childhood illnesses are reduced. And you reduced child obesity, which is huge now. And we have all these problems going on with, as we grow into adults, we have all these food-related illnesses, etc., that can all be pointed back to the fact that there was no breastfeeding, or very little of it, early on in your development. Let's take a quick second for a station identification break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. We're discussing the gap in breastfeeding between black mothers and white mothers primarily, with Hispanics being somewhere in between. And the reason why this is important is, we've talked about the reasons why. We've alluded to how it fits into your oppression under the system of white supremacy, who basically engineers a lot of this stuff. But like we always talk about, we have to see the pitfalls and we have to avoid them. We have to pick the sense out of the nonsense and choose things that's going to edify us, not break us down. And I was just getting into some of the other reasons why we should breastfeed, and that's the metaphysical. And some of you might not be in tune with the metaphysical. You might shun it for whatever reasons. A lot of times it's religious. But just bear with me for a second here. I want to just talk about some stuff I was researching early on the topic. When we talk about the metaphysical benefits of breastfeeding, you have to understand that when you're feeding as a baby, when you're feeding from the breast, which is close to the heart, you get to experience a lot of feeling of love. There's a lot of emotion of love emanating from the breast. There's joy, there's happiness, there's respect, there's honesty, there's compassion, there's understanding, there's generosity. And in fact, there's self-love. And that goes back and forth between the child and the mother until there's a balance that's established. And if you know anything about life, you know that once a balance is established, there's peace. Let me put back on my background music. So once there's a balance between mother and child, there will be peace. And I think a lot of the breakdown in relationships between adults, adult parents, adult mothers, adult children, stems from the lack of breastfeeding. And this is not an all or nothing thing. It's not that you can breastfeed for a bit and you'll be fine. I'm going to talk about this later on. But you need to breastfeed for extended times, periods of time, and that will build the bond. That will build the balance. That will bring the peace between these two entities. With the milk, again, speaking from a metaphysical standpoint, with the milk being received, you receive creativity. It stabilizes energy. It activates the pineal gland. I'm going to talk about the pineal gland in a second. It boosts brain and central nervous system function. That milk is super important. It also boosts your immunity. This is what I alluded to about not getting sick as a child and not having a lot of these childhood ailments that we're seeing. Also, as a child, when you consume that milk from the mother's breast, it ensures your connection to the universal energy. And it expands your awareness. That's a part of that pineal gland opening up. If you don't know what the pineal gland is, basically, when you hear people talk about open your third eye, that's the pineal gland. And they found that the pineal gland in black folks is more active than in white folks. In white folks, the pineal gland has been calcified, has been hardened. Ours is still more elastic. So that means that ours produces more melatonin, a hormone that's excreted during darkness. It also produces more serotonin, which is another hormone that aids in our sleep, in our perception, in our memory, in our motor skills. So when you see black folks have a natural ability at being good athletes, it's because our pineal gland is very much functional. It's very much active. So when you get the milk from your mother's bosom, you get the activation of that pineal gland. And then you get all the benefits from the activation of the pineal gland. So think about what was happening when black mothers during slavery was giving the milk that they should have been giving to their own offspring. What was happening when they were giving it to these white children? What metaphysical properties were being passed from the black woman to the white child that the black child was not getting? And that's when we start to, if you start to think about it in that respect, we can kind of understand another aspect in which we've been failing, which we've been losing ground to these folks. We raise their children not only to be respectful, to have some compassion, at least as children, to have some generosity. We raised them. We gave them those qualities. Our black women gave them those qualities in their breast milk. For them, their pineal gland, most times, for most of them, is calcified to a high degree. But let's think about those whose pineal glands aren't. You can probably trace that back to a wet nurse, which is essentially a slave, an African woman who was enslaved and forced to feed these children this breast milk. So I'm trying to paint this picture for you of, wow, what have we given? What have we given is not just the free labor, but what have we given to them that makes them even better? What have we refused our own to give them? And so in talking about it from a metaphysical standpoint, talking about the bonds that are created, the joy, the happiness, the respect, the honesty, the compassion, the generosity. When you don't breastfeed, you don't have that. Or you have very little of it. There's very little balance between you and your child. And so there's very little peace. When you see a lot of grown people not in tune and not close with their mother in particular, I think a lot of it has to do with that. When you have parents who treat you, their child, like any Negro stranger around the corner, down, up the street or down the block, I think this plays into a lot of that. There's other factors, of course. Because like I said, this oppression that we struggle with affects us in all aspects of life. So we should start to be able to paint this picture of, the error that we've made, the error that we've made that's now costing us still today. Now, I talked about all these things, what the breast milk does, what the act of breastfeeding does, how it affects the pineal gland, which is the thing that differentiates us most from white folks. See, the thing is, scientists, they can create a formula. And they could push that on you. I mean, they push formula on you when you give. In fact, nowadays with big data, they're able to send you formula even before you have the child. They could look at your spending patterns at Target or Walmart or what have you. They figure out that, you have a registry. They figure out when you're due. They send you formula early. You go in the hospital to have a kid. Any of you who've had children before, tell me if I'm wrong. Put it in the comment section if you listen to this on YouTube. And if you're not listening to this on YouTube, and you're on iTunes or CastBox or any one of those outlets for podcasts, head over to our YouTube page and leave a comment. We're going to leave some questions down there. We'd like to have a dialogue, especially with black women. But this is what's going on with this phenomenon of the breastfeeding gap. They're marketing this stuff to you heavy. They're pushing this on you heavy. And I haven't gotten to the real reason, the real deep reason why this is happening. Before I get to the real reason why this is ultimately happening, I want to point out something to you who might be carrying a child right now, who might be in the midst of trying to breastfeed your children. The gold standard that they found for breastfeeding is at least 6 months of exclusive mother's milk between mother and child. In the research, when you look up this phenomenon. In the research, they found that right now, these days, only about 20% of black women breastfeed for 6 months exclusively. You know what percent of white women breastfeed exclusively? Twice as many. 40% of white women breastfeed exclusively. Now, before I get into the real significance of this, because you might be wondering, well, why am I talking about this? You might have heard others talk about this before, but I like to talk about things and talk about how they relate to our current condition. One of the things that contributes heavy to this phenomenon, this gap between black women and white women where breastfeeding is concerned, is, and this is especially true in America, so if you're listening to this in the Caribbean, it's a little different for you. I'm not certain what the circumstances are in Africa, but I do believe it's similar to the Caribbean. In America, women are only home roughly 6-7 weeks, maybe 8 weeks after they give birth, before they have to carry their ass back to work. And when you look at things in the black community traditionally through Jim Crow era to now, in fact, even in slavery, as I mentioned before, because wet nurses weren't just responsible for being wet nurses, they still had to be laborers as well. So it's always been the case in the black community here that the households were two-income households. Women were going out there and working. If you look at a lot of movies that show you the Jim Crow era, you see black women tired, taking the bus, going to work when it was dark in the morning, coming back home when it was dark at night, and doing it again tomorrow. All the while having children of their own. In fact, I was reading something one time where they were talking about the fact that there was a black woman. I really forgot the title of the article. But it was a southern black woman talking about the fact that she was a mommy and sometimes wet nurse to these white folks and their children when she had 3 children of her own at home. She had the unfortunate situation of her husband having been dead for about 15 years, and they were only married for about 5. And she had a daughter at 18 who she saw once every 2 weeks. So when you add in the fact that black women tend to have to work jobs soon thereafter after having children, using the formula to feed their children makes a lot of sense to them. And I understand it, ladies. I understand why it would make sense. I understand the convenience of it, and I understand marketing as well. The powers that be, they understand that too. And that's why they push it so heavy to you. With white women, on the other hand, a lot of them, not all, but especially in affluent white society, upper middle class and affluent white society, their women are home. Their women get to stay home with the children 24/7. The husbands go out and work. And so for them, they had the privilege to naturally breastfeed their children and to gain some, if not all, of the benefits that I mentioned before that you gain personally as a mother and that you transmit to your children in the act of breastfeeding. So I understand why certain decisions were made. I'm not coming down on black women, but I do believe that black men, black women, everyone who is involved in the bringing forth of new generations of black society, we need to be armed with certain knowledge, and we need to implement this knowledge. So here's the significance of all of this conversation. The significance is that they found that breastfed babies who are breastfed at the gold standard of 6 months exclusively on breast milk, they have higher IQs as adults. In puberty, they have higher IQs than anyone else. And this is not just in one group, this is across race. This is across socioeconomics. This is across everything. This study was carried out over, I think, 30 years. And they found that children who were breastfed for at least 6 months exclusively had higher IQs. They turned out to be well educated. And as you know, especially in white society, the more educated you are, the higher earner you are, or the more income you make as an adult. Here's the really, really interesting stat about that, because you might think, well, you do your 6 months and you're good. But they found that the longer you breastfeed beyond 6 months, even higher is the IQ. Even more educated is the person, and therefore they earn even more. Now, of course, it's not just about the milk. There's other things involved, like a key thing that's involved, and I really want to hear from black women about this. What are your thoughts? The other thing that could be playing a part here is that if you're a mother, and I want you to follow me on this one. If you're a mother and you're motivated to breastfeed exclusively for at least 6 months, but even beyond 6 months, if you're motivated that much to do that, the belief is also that you'll also be motivated to motivate your children and to stimulate the ability of your kids. So I want you to think about that. And this kind of goes back to previous podcasts that I've had discussing low energy individuals. If you're high enough energy of an individual as a mother, that you will go through the arduous task, and that's another thing I want to really hammer down here, coming down to the final moments of this broadcast. Breastfeeding, fellas, is not easy. Women suffer all kinds of pains. The ducts are clogged. They put in a lot of work trying to pump or have the child suckle, and very little milk sometimes. They have to do all these different things. So it's not an easy thing. I want to acknowledge that for the women out here. It's not easy, I know. But I want you to follow this thought that I'm expressing right now, that the researchers, in fact, also hinted at as well. If you have the motivation to breastfeed for 6 months at least, Exclusively. No formula, no nothing else. And even more still, if you have the motivation to go further beyond 6 months, then it stands to reason that you probably will also be motivated to motivate your children more, to flesh out their abilities, to carry out activities that stimulates your children's minds, to make their brains stronger. And that could be why we see that breastfed children have higher IQs, more education, well educated, and therefore become higher earners in the future as adults. So this is something that we really have to take into consideration. I talked about it from just the regular thought process of and the regular understanding of science of what goes on in breastfeeding, the properties in breast milk that you pass on to your children. I talked about it from a metaphysical standpoint. I really want you guys to start getting in tune with your third eye. I've talked about using your third eye before when I discussed the movie Planet of the Apes. I was a breastfed child. But now I want to talk to you about it. Now I'm talking to you about it from a practical standpoint. That if you deal with the motivation, or if you're motivated to breastfeed, not only will they get the things I spoke about earlier, they being your children, but you too will get those benefits that I mentioned early on in the broadcast. Not only that, but there's the metaphysical aspects that you will have between you and your child. But on top of that, just in doing it, just in you having the high energy to breastfeed your child for longer periods of time, you're going to make a better, in terms of intelligence, you're going to make a better black community going forward. Fellas, you need to help the women around you as much as you can in encouraging them to breastfeed. Mothers of women who are becoming mothers, even if you didn't do it yourself, you need to hear this and pass this on to your daughters. And make sure that they, in turn, become breastfeeding moms, because the benefits are seen. You see the benefits. Even if you just take away the natural component in terms of benefits, what you would be doing is you would be building a black woman who has that high energy level, that motivation to motivate their child and to bring out the abilities within their children. What I want you guys to do for me, if you don't mind, I'm going to post some questions below this video on YouTube. So if you're listening on YouTube, look down. You'll see some questions there. If you're listening to this on another platform, by all means, head over to our YouTube page, the Bitter Medicine Podcast. You'll see some questions. Let's have a discussion. And I really want to hear from black mothers. Knowing the stuff that I talked about here, some of you probably didn't know it before, some of you might have known it before, and still you don't breastfeed, and you may have your reasons. I'd like to hear those reasons. Let's have a dialogue about this. This was a fun topic. I just came across this article and I thought about it. And as I mentioned, I like to think of things in terms of how it affects us as a group. So for many people, they don't think breastfeeding is a big deal. You pop some formula in a bottle, give it to a baby, and they'll be fine. They won't cry. They're good. But we're seeing in the research that I talked about in this show that there's more to this. And this affects us. And we need to understand what not to continue doing. We need to get back to breastfeeding our children. We need to get back to those benefits, even if it's not just about the benefits of, the natural benefits that's conferred, but there's a benefit in building ourselves and building our character, both for mothers and fathers who assist in this process. Let's build our own character, because that's going to push us to help build the characters of our children. I want to thank you guys for tuning in today. By all means, please share this, like, comment, subscribe. Please share this on your social media. Please discuss it with family members. And until the next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.